Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And today we've been to the Mac to not only see The Old Dark House, directed by James Whale in 1932, but to hear José introduce it.
Yes, I've been doing a couple of those. I did the Frankenstein one as well, and the brief was to not only introduce the film, but to kind of try to relate it to queer cultures, which I found a bit difficult to do at the Frankenstein screening because I hadn't realized it was going to be so full of children. So actually I had to change quite a lot of what I was going to say, just to take into account that there were children listening. But, today there was like nobody there under 50, I'd say, actually. It was like, well, you. You were the youngest person there. Which was a pity, I thought, Yeah. Well, I don't know. What did you think of the film?
I think there's clearly less interest because people have heard of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is it's iconic, to use the word of the day, but it really fits. And you pointed out in your introduction that what James Whale did in developing the look of Frankenstein has stayed with us to the modern day.
Yes.
And not only, you pointed out the Incredible Hulk and things like that, but just that image. Yeah. That image stays with us. Sure. And it is the image of Frankenstein now.
Yeah, that was developed for that film.
So that's going to be, I think, a big reason why, certainly why kids were showing up at Frankenstein, but not here. This is 72 minutes long, and at points I felt like I was really getting my money's worth because it felt long at times.
Really?
Yeah, it did to me. It's interesting. I think it's interesting when the film starts. So it's these guys are driving through, mud and rain and flooding, trying to get to Shrewsbury. And they can't stick it out. They find a house and they beg the owners of this house for help. The owner is a very, very old man and his sister, and they're sort of beaten up. He always looks like Frankenstein in that he feels like he's been stitched together, his face. Their butler, played by Boris Karloff. And a couple of other people arrive, and this whole thing starts that this house is quite creepy. They're trying to stick out the night, and things start. The secrets that the house holds, I guess, start to be revealed. And early on, when this is all starting up and it's just the relationships between the characters and kind of the dinner scene in particular, I thought this is nice and interesting and fun. And then I thought it slowed down, particularly when you get to the patriarch of the house and the long explanation about the history. Because there's just this is just a monologue explaining why I should be interested in this house. But after that, it goes so quickly. Things really start to kick off to the point where I felt like it actually needed a bit more sort of, this thing about this character Saul, who, spoiler for a 1932 film, the people who run this house, that's their brother, and he's very dangerous, and they keep him locked up in a room upstairs. And this is something that the patriarch tells to the characters. But as soon as we know this, other characters start talking about Saul as though we already sort of have heard about him. It feels very, very fast all of a sudden.
Well, Saul is the secret that the house has been hiding.
Yeah.
And actually, is he the secret, or is he the one that reveals the secret? Because what we know is that two of his brothers got killed, or a brother and a sister got killed, right? And the question is, was it Saul who killed them, or is Saul, being kind of kept in his room because he knows who did it?
Yeah, because he claims that his brother and sister killed their sister.
Yes.
Is that to you something that is like an interesting sort of hanging thread to pick up?
So that's tension, because also there's the line where Horace Femm says that he's kind of stuck in the house because the police are after him, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So why would So there's a sense that he, at least in his mind, he's a criminal, right? And I don't think it's resolved in the film, but I just think that the not being sure of is an interesting dimension to the film.
Yes, I mean it is true that you don't actually, at least from my perspective, I didn't feel like I had a handle on whether Saul was a bad guy or a good guy. we first hear about him, when we eventually do hear about him, we're supposed to be thinking of him as a bad guy. He's tried to burn down the house once before, and that's why they're keeping him locked up, and that's why they have this big burly butler who's also dangerous, but he's the only one who can handle this guy. But of course, once he comes out, he seems quite meek, and he explains, they killed our sister, and I think the implication, I don't think he says it as such, but the implication is I tried to burn the house down because of that. Like, they revenge, or they deserve it, whatever it might be. But then, of course, he starts threatening Pendle, the character who he's kind of interacting with. And so you are left with this unresolved idea of actually who he is and what the relationships are, or who is good and who is bad. You know, because once he comes out, you start thinking, oh, right, the guys who've been giving these people refuge all night, they're really the bad guys. But it also seems that they genuinely are under threat from this guy. It's kind of difficult to tell, right?
Yeah, I like that, because, you know, if one of the lenses through which I look at the film is really as a kind of a queer work, that is one of the ways in which it is, the notion of good and evil, villain, upstairs, downstairs, visitors, householders, those things are kind of fluid and strained, and they kind of move.
So it suggests a fluidity of identity in a sense to you.
Yes, but also of what is evil, and it kind of complicates all of those things, right? Because you see the people in the house, they might be evil, but they also might be the victims of that evil, and maybe they've been twisted because they've had to live in those conditions and with that knowledge, and and in that solitude, right? So I think it all kind of lends itself very easily to queer readings on all kinds of levels. But I also think that the film is not just like a queer film, that kind of, it is also about the post-war period, about disillusioned servicemen, about sexual relations, about class. The whole Charles Laughton character is he's got a chip in his shoulder, and he's out for class revenge because of what he perceives that upper class people did to his wife, right? He thinks they killed his wife through mocking her. So, I think the film is very rich that way, actually, as well as being just kind of, fun to watch. And I think the one thing I really want to underline is, I saw the film yesterday on my TV, which is quite large, right? And really, it was a completely different experience watching it today on the big screen. It just is. And I just want to underline that because, kind of, people keep making all kinds of excuses. Oh, my screen is so large, or I have a projector, whatever. But, it is just a completely different experience because of the size of the image, first of all, the quality of the projection, the kind of texture that you had today. The lighting was so visible and evident and atmospheric. And also the audience. Like, I think the combination of all of those things, to me, it became a different experience.
Yeah, it brings the film to life in a different way.
Absolutely. So I want to underline that because also you see things, you notice things, it's all more beautiful. It all affects your body in a different way. I don't know quite how to describe it.
We're going to go see the new Knives Out shortly, and that's been given to us for a week in the cinema, but that's it's going to be a Netflix film from now on. It's a Netflix film, and it brings home to me the point that I don't like that we are now being bequeathed a week of cinema exhibition of these films now from the kind Netflix gods and Amazon Prime gods. That's what we're getting these days.
Yes, and I mean I must say all of those not very good Kenneth Branagh Christie adaptations, Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, which I know you like, but I don't like them. But even so...
Wait. I hated the second one as much as you did.
All right. Well, you liked the first one a lot more than I did.
Yeah.
It was still, like, I went to the cinema and I saw it and I had fun. I couldn't bear to, they're now all available online for free. You could watch them on your TV. And you just could not be bothered. Like, it's kind of, you watch 5 minutes and you go... Right, and I'm sure a lot of that is the conditions of viewing and not just the thing itself. So
not for free, incidentally. You have to pay for Netflix still. You haven't forgotten that.
So anyway,
going back to the old dark house, one of the things that you brought up in your introduction was that it got a bit of a chilly reception when it first came out, and it wasn't as big a hit as his other films had been.
I mean, it was...
He'd done Frankenstein by then.
Yeah, it was initially a hit, right? Though, the reviews were not as enthusiastic, and it wasn't, because Frankenstein was a sociological phenomenon. It was one of the biggest hits of the year. But, the Old Dark House did well.
Right.
What I found interesting upon doing some, really minor research at the BFI a few weeks ago was that upon its re-release, just a few years after, like in 1945, people were saying, what is this piece of junk? It should have been left in its vaults. Right?
Yeah.
And then by 1966, there was a camp appreciation of it. It had, there was a different audience and a different way of looking at that film that kind of rescued it in a way. And then by 2006, it was an established cult hit with already a history of cult audiences' appreciation for it. So I think that in itself is very interesting. Yeah.
And does it seem to be particularly a queer audience that has kind of discovered it?
Yes.
As opposed to a more general sort of horror audience?
Well, I think both.
Right.
Yeah. But one thing adds to the other. Yeah, it's part of the film's weirdness and attraction. Yeah, that kind of, it has those elements that before might have been unnameable. Yeah, more like a feeling you have. But actually now they could be given a name. I mean, I'm sure even straight audiences, when Ernest Thesiger, comes down the staircase and says, "Hello, I'm Horace Femm," right? Like, that's bound to get like a response, right? And his campiness with the role, like the way he plays it. I'm thinking of doing a video essay with Robert De Niro's Taxi Driver. Am I talking to you? Am I talking to you? And then Ernest Thesiger, have a potato, have a potato, have a... all the different ways he does have a potato.
Have a potato was nice. I like how have a potato becomes... He says it a couple of times and it becomes a line that you recognise. And then he uses it as a way of shutting Charles Lawton up. It's a really nice way of... It's the same line, but it's been given a different... The reading. Context is a different meaning, I really enjoyed that. There were things about the film I thought were kind of, I guess, sort of simple. I mean, maybe this is one of the things where we talk about the invention of what cinema horror was kind of, some of it, or some of the Gothic styles happening in James Whale's films.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. It's not out-and-out horror in the way that other Universal films were. It's not a monster movie.
No.
But it's certainly building on the Gothic house, the haunted house, right? And the secret that's being kept upstairs, and
the two worlds, the external world impinging, and the people who impinge being transformed by,
So this is one of those things where I go, does some of that seem just a little dull or simplistic to me because it has now been established? I don't know. I think I felt some of it. Some of it felt like a kind of eaten mess of kind of plot and ideas and tropes that were kind of being stuffed into a film that wasn't quite cohering.
Well, I think there's a bit of that, but I think it's more cohesive than... I think it's more cohesive than you make it out to be. So which elements didn't...
Well, it's when I refer to the speed with which things start moving in the final final movement of the film, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So, the Saul character is first revealed. It's been quite gradual up until that point. We've had Ernest Thesiger, very interestingly, being terrified of his own house.
Yes.
Which is great, and it really cues you into why is he so scared of this place and what does it hold and so on. Eventually, your man goes upstairs and sees the locks on the doors, and so this is all quite gradual, and something is being hidden behind there. He's heard a voice as well, and that came from upstairs. And what's that? Those are two separate things. For one thing, is part of what I'm talking about. It kind of, so the voice, it comes from the other door, which is the patriarch's voice, and the locks upstairs are what's holding Saul in. We've also, on top of this, got the Boris Karloff character who is getting drunk and could be dangerous and violent, possibly sexually violent. He's certainly interested in the female character who is sexualized and dressed.
And Saul.
Yes, well, you pointed that out, didn't you?
Yeah. Which is another really interesting thing about the film. He's very tender with him, and he carries him upstairs, and he kisses him. Yeah.
So that's kind of another thing that adds on to what is becoming quite a full film. I don't know. I just felt like, and maybe it's also because it then starts to be dealt with quite briefly because the film is speeding up towards its conclusion. I don't know. I just felt things were being handled very quickly.
They are handled very quickly, but I think it packs it in and it works. So the chorus girl, who's not very good chorus girl, who everyone takes for a hooker because she's with this man, though actually the man doesn't touch her, she says. I mean, one of the things that I forgot to mention is that it is a pre-code film.
Yes.
And it's quite overt about all the sexual stuff, right? Including the old lady touching Gloria Stewart and saying, this too will rot your flesh, right? Like, yeah, so I think it has like this whole thing about sex and sexuality and age and, So yes, it does.
And disfigurement as well. I mean, not only the Boris Karloff character is facially, he's got these cuts and scars, but the distortion of the mirrors that you pointed out.
Yes.
And that's what when she's kind of being driven mental by the old lady who's been tormenting her with these images of age and decrepitude, and then she starts to see it in the mirrors, and we're shown that. We're shown these hall of mirror faces of herself. Yes. Which actually become quite creepy at one point, where the one mirror image is like, it's like she hasn't got a nose; it's kind of closed off.
It's very imaginative. It's very imaginatively filmed throughout. I think it's a really imaginative film, and I think it's also kind of a very well structured narrative. So, on the one hand, you have the Melvyn Douglas character, who is someone who's been through the war, and is now disillusioned and drinking too much, and he's a 20s type, really. This is a pre-code film, so you have the chorus girl who's basically kind of selling herself, to be with the rich industrialist. Of course they're telling you they're not sleeping together, but you can imagine other things, and she's definitely kind of, a whole other issue that to me really brings up the depression. It's a depression kind of story. Then you have the rich industrialist, kind of brilliantly played by Charles Laughton, in what I think is one of his earliest roles. I think actually it was the first film he made in America.
Right.
Though I think The Sign of the Cross was released earlier. But I think this was the one he did first. I think he went to do one and ended up, that was delayed, and then he ended up doing this one. And he's absolutely brilliant. I mean, you could see, he's meant to be a Yorkshireman or something, right? And you definitely... he is Sir this or that, but you could really feel like a man of the people, and you feel his anger about his treatment, and he really does evoke.
You definitely want to know how he got that Sir in front of his name.
Well, by making money, you're told. So I think the film is really bringing up all of these issues in very interesting ways, because it's all about dislocation or displacement, or people who don't belong, or people who've lost their place. And earlier on, when we're talking about what is queer about this film, those are aspects that make it queer. That is all about, outsiders coming in, things not being what they seem, kind of love finding perverse manifestations, or, the absence of love kind of perverting people. So I think you see all of that in this film.
I want to revisit, if we can, something that we said right at the start, which I think I'm unclear on. Where I was talking about when the Saul character not knowing if he's the bad guy or if family's the bad guy and so on, and you were saying that relates to queerness, and I said, is that because it's a question of identity being fluid. And you're saying, well, no, it's more about a bigger question of what is good and what is evil. And I'm curious as to where the relationship between that kind of question and queerness.
Well, there's that famous saying of, what is it? People have their motives that motives themselves don't know, or something like that. But I think, what is questions of morality, and what's right and what's wrong, obviously depends on how they're defined. So here the sister is very much, has a very clear sense of right and wrong in church and kind of the formalities of it. But, is Saul the victim of a crime, or is Saul the perpetrator of a crime? It's an interesting thing, because he couches it in the story of Saul and David, right? And, you know, Saul loved David, or I forget what the exact story is, and I'm not very good on, you know, Bible allegories. Yeah. But he's talking about a love story that led to murder. Yeah. But to go back to your initial question, of course, you know, these things have to do with perspective. So I think that, you know, there are like some absolutes. Yes, like you could say murder is wrong, right? Though then even those you could say, well, if you kill somebody to defend your child, is that wrong? Yeah, you could always kind of complicate it. But I think certainly in whatever relates to sexual orientation, you know, we know historically that it is very much a question of perspective. Are you doing something wrong if it's natural? Or is just the perspective or the point of view, or, you know, a kind of a religious or social exclusion that makes it wrong? Yeah?
Yeah.
So, now, I think the film does slightly bring up these things, or it brings up these things in skewed ways, you know, particularly through this kind of ambiguity for me about what happened. Yeah, what was the originary story? Yeah, and who's guilty in this house? Yeah, you know, kind of what the actions that damn this house. Yeah, kind of, you know, what's the truth and what's just a kind of a perspective that ends up being judgmental. Yeah, but that is a pre-selected perspective that excludes, you know, any other judgment. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
No less clear than normal.
Okay. So I think there are many ways in which the film lends itself to queer readings, right? I mean, I think, first of all, the campness of Horace Femm. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because the film is 90 years old, right? But those mannerisms, that way of speaking, that, you know, that response to things, I mean, someone could be doing it, you know, in a sitcom or a drag show or whatever today, right?
It feels like it's a type that predated that and has lasted beyond.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? So that character alone is something. Then there are things like the patriarch being played by a woman, yeah, which is, you know, a whole other thing, really, and a really important thing to cast a woman in that role. Then there's the story of Saul himself, yeah, because there's this suggestion that there is like this love story between the butler, yeah, and Saul, that it might also be a perverse one, because, you know, you don't know whether to take him at his word or not, but he says he beats me, right? Yeah, but then kind of he's the one who takes care of him and who nurtures him and who kisses him and who holds him and who mourns his death, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of, I think, you know, those things are quite operative in the film. And then there are more abstract things, like, again, you know, people going into the house, right? Because everybody who comes in from the outside is, in quotation marks, normal. But everything in the house is strange, yeah?
Yeah, the relationships seem uncomfortable and weird, and when these quote-unquote normal people come in, they are confused by it. And they are, or become, you know, later confused by it or become intimidated by it.
Yeah. So I think all of those things are really interesting. I'm not sure if I've worked them all through, but I think to me what was interesting about this film is, you know, how it really does use camp, yeah, in the sense of taking the form of something and applying it to something else to be both critical and humorous about it and to dislodge it, right? And actually, you know, so one of the famous sayings of one of the few things I remember because my memory is so bad is, but, you know, kind of somebody in New York goes to an S&M club for the first time, right? And they go, ooh, Toto, I think we're not in Kansas anymore, right? Yeah, so kind of that type of attitude. And I think that's something that is evident throughout the film, even to the extent of like these outsiders going into this house and wondering where the hell are we. We're not in a situation where things operate as are normal or as we're used to them. There's a different kind of set of codes here. And I was fascinated by the idea that ostensibly the most successful director of this period at Universal, who was one of the few high-flying directors who was British.
From Dudley, no less.
From Dudley, no less, who was also gay, and who kind of set up a visual vocabulary through Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and The Old Dark House, for a whole series of aspects of horror that actually lend themselves very easily to gay readings, right? So in Frankenstein, the person who wants love and acceptance, but who's shunned and who's chased by the community and, finally burned. The Invisible Man, right? The person who you can't see, but, who might be very damaging. The sense of the Invisible Man as a queer trope is something, that, very famously in mid-20th century America, that was kind of one of the things that was thought to be like the scourge of communism. Yeah, communism in our midst, right? Like also they were invisible and secret and so on, but they were amongst us. Of course, it's the same with gay people who were often thought to be communists on their own.
That hasn't changed really. It's still the gay liberal agenda.
So I just find that interesting that queerness and horror coincide, in the work of this British gay director that set up a kind of a visual imaginary or vocabulary. It's not that these ideas didn't exist before, but he kind of visualized them and gave them shape, right? In ways that remain very important.
James Whale was openly gay, wasn't he?
Well, people say that, but to me, I always wonder what that means, because, if it's illegal and if it could make you lose your job and get you arrested, what that probably means is just that, you didn't have a fake marriage, or you didn't pretend to be something that you weren't, but you certainly didn't go about announcing it. You didn't, go waltzing or dancing with your boyfriend at the Mocambo or something. Right? Yeah. So, so people say he was openly gay, but, how open can you be in 1920s or 30s?
Well, there's also a difference between openly gay and it being common knowledge.
Yeah.
Among others, among the moviegoers.
I'm sure that it was something that was known by his inner circle, but I'd be very surprised if it was known beyond that. The other famous director of the day, not English, but much more famous, would have been George Cukor. And of course now he's criticized because, he would have these Sunday parties and, he'd invite all his gay friends and all the cute guys around town and, there were a few hustlers and so on, right? But you think, how else would you organize a social life at a time where your very existence was criminal, right? So of course it had to be secret, it had to be compartmentalized, hidden, yes, and so on. Ostensibly, James Whale, was more open than that, but how much more open you could be without being put in jail in those days, I don't know. I don't think much.
We were talking briefly earlier about the visual distortions that the mirrors provide. There's another one as well I noticed. You pointed out in your introduction the shot through the flames. It's repeated once or twice. That we see the people sitting around the fire, and we see through the fireplace from behind and the fire. But there's a couple of shots where it's been taken from that angle. You don't see the fire, but what you do see is the image of everyone being distorted by the flames, by the heat roiling the air.
Yes.
That's interesting.
I think there are films that are very elegant. They're very, very visually elegant, really. They're both sparse and clean, and they have this very powerful graphic qualities. So I think they're much better films than I expected them to be. Yeah, and they're really kind of visually very, very memorable.
How far does your history go back with this film? Has it been important to you before? When did you first see it?
No, not at all. So I think it's something that I've seen before, but that I didn't know much about, except that it was James Whale, and and I have seen The Bride of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, and in fact I've seen Waterloo Bridge and Showboat and all his big hits. Really, I have seen, but it's interesting, isn't it? I think I was put off by the film. I forget what the title of the film was, but the one with Brendan Fraser and Ian Gods and Monsters.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I saw that when it came out, and I was kind of put off by it. So kind of James Whale as a personality was never a great interest of mine, though he is becoming one.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Do you want to add any?
No, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that. That's very informative.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.